What if the most celebrated immigrant success story in American history was actually a blueprint for extracting wealth from workers on a scale never before achieved? Most people think Andrew Carnegie built America's steel empire through innovation, hard work, and the promise of the American dream. They are not wrong, but they are missing the most important part. Between 1873 and 1901, one Scottish immigrant constructed a system that would transform not just steel production, but the entire relationship between capital and labor in America. By the time he sold his company for $480 million, equivalent to roughly $310 billion in today's money, Carnegie had perfected a mechanism that extracted wealth from thousands of workers while reshaping how Americans understood success itself. The pattern he established did not end with him. It is still operating today. Let me show you how one man's rise revealed a deeper architecture of American capitalism, one that most people never see beneath the surface story of libraries and philanthropy. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1848. He was 13 years old. His family had fled Scotland after his father, a handloom weaver, could no longer compete with mechanized textile production. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Young Carnegie watched industrialization destroy his father's livelihood in Scotland, then crossed an ocean to a country where that same force was just beginning to reshape everything. The lesson was immediate and permanent. Mechanization was not the enemy. Mechanization was the future, and those who controlled the machines would control everything else. Carnegie's official biography follows a familiar arc. He started as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, earning $1.20 per week. He became a telegraph messenger, then a telegraph operator, then secretary to Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Each promotion seemed to prove the promise that America rewarded talent and determination. By 1859, at age 24, Carnegie had become superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. He was earning $1,500 per year, more than his father had earned in a lifetime. The narrative writes itself. Immigrant boy makes good through intelligence and work ethic. The American dream incarnate. But here is what most people do not understand about Carnegie's early success. His position at the Pennsylvania Railroad was not just a job. It was an education in the architecture of industrial capitalism. Carnegie did not just learn how to run a railroad. He learned how capital consolidation worked. He learned how to manipulate stock. He learned how companies could extract value from workers while concentrating wealth at the top. He learned that the relationship between management and labor was fundamentally adversarial, and that this adversarialism was not a bug in the system, but its essential feature. Carnegie made his first significant money not through innovation or production, but through insider knowledge and stock manipulation. In 1856, Thomas Scott offered Carnegie the chance to invest in Adams Express Company stock. Carnegie borrowed $500 from a local banker to buy 10 shares. The dividend checks that arrived, $20 per month, taught Carnegie something crucial. Capital could generate income without labor. Money could make money. This was not about working harder. This was about owning the means of production. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, Carnegie was already accumulating capital through multiple investments. He put money into ironworks, bridge companies, oil companies, and railroad sleeping cars. He never served in the war himself. Instead, he helped organize military transportation for the Union, all while his investments grew. When the war ended in 1865, Carnegie was worth approximately $50,000, equivalent to roughly $1 million today. He was 30 years old. The official story celebrates this as earned success, but Carnegie had learned something darker. Wealth came not from labor, but from positioning yourself between labor and capital, then extracting value from that position. The steel industry in the 1860s was fragmented and inefficient. Iron was still the dominant material for construction and rails. Steel production existed, but it was expensive and inconsistent. Then, in 1856, Henry Bessemer in England had patented a process that could convert iron to steel quickly and cheaply by blowing air through molten iron to remove impurities. By the late 1860s, American industrialists were beginning to grasp what this technology meant. Steel could replace iron in bridges, buildings, and railroads. The market was enormous. Whoever controlled steel production would control America's industrial future. Carnegie entered the steel business in 1873 when he founded the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. The timing was deliberate. The Panic of 1873 had crashed the economy. Labor was desperate. Land was cheap. Equipment could be purchased at bankruptcy prices. Carnegie built his first steel mill during one of the worst economic depressions in American history, and he did so intentionally. Economic collapse was not something to survive. It was something to exploit. This was not the first time this pattern appeared. John D. Rockefeller consolidated oil refining during the same panic. J.P. Morgan would later consolidate banking during the Panic of 1907. The mechanism was always the same. Use crisis to acquire assets cheaply, then dominate the industry when recovery came. But the real architecture of Carnegie's empire was not just about timing. It was about a systematic approach to cost reduction that would transform American industry. Carnegie called it hard driving. The term sounded innocuous. It was not. Hard driving meant extracting maximum output from workers and equipment at minimum cost. It meant running blast furnaces continuously, even when it destroyed the machinery and exhausted the workers. It meant cutting wages whenever possible and replacing skilled workers with unskilled immigrants who had no bargaining power. It meant treating labor as a variable cost to be minimized, not as human beings with lives and families. The numbers tell the story. In 1880, Carnegie's main mill employed 3,800 workers. They worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. The only break came during the changeover between day and night shifts, which happened twice a month and was called the long turn. During the long turn, workers stayed on the job for 24 consecutive hours. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a steel worker in Carnegie's mill in 1885, you worked 84 hours per week, every week, with one 24-hour shift every 2 weeks. That is 3,600 hours per year of hard physical labor in temperatures that regularly exceeded 130 degrees near the furnaces. Carnegie's genius was understanding that mechanization plus desperate labor created maximum profit. The Bessemer process reduced the need for skilled iron workers. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe would work for wages that native-born workers would not accept. In 1880, the average steel worker in Carnegie's mills earned approximately $500 per year. By 1892, that number had dropped to approximately $450, even as Carnegie's profits soared. This was not accidental market forces. This was systematic wage suppression enabled by continuous immigration and the threat of replacement. The pattern Carnegie established was not new. The same mechanism had operated in Britain's textile mills during the 1820s and 1830s, where mechanization allowed factory owners to replace skilled weavers with low-wage workers, often children. In America's South, plantation owners had used enslaved labor to extract maximum value from cotton production. Carnegie's innovation was applying this logic to industrial production in the North, wrapped in the language of progress and efficiency. He was not bringing slavery to steel production, but he was creating a system where workers had so little power that the distinction barely mattered. And here is what really reveals the architecture. Carnegie himself rarely visited his mills. He spent most of his time in New York or traveling in Europe. He installed managers whose job was to drive costs down and output up, then measured them purely on financial results. The human cost was invisible in the accounting. When workers died in accidents, and they died regularly, the company simply hired replacements. Between 1889 and 1892, there were over 300 recorded deaths in Carnegie's steel mills. The actual number was certainly higher, as many injuries and deaths went unreported. That is more than 2 deaths per week, every week, for 3 years. No one was held responsible. No safety improvements were mandated. The system simply continued operating. Now the stage was set for the mechanism to reveal itself fully. By 1890, Carnegie Steel Company was producing more steel than all of Britain combined. Carnegie personally was earning approximately $25 million per year, equivalent to roughly $800 million today. His workers earned $15 to $20 per week. Let that sink in. The ratio between Carnegie's annual income and his average worker's income was approximately 43,000 to 1. This was not just inequality. This was wealth extraction operating at industrial scale. The same pattern Carnegie perfected would reappear throughout American history. Henry Ford would use it in automobile production in the 1910s. Sam Walton would use it in retail in the 1970s. Jeff Bezos would use it in e-commerce in the 2000s. The details change. The mechanism remains identical. Consolidate market power, minimize labor costs through replacement threat and wage suppression, extract maximum value, concentrate wealth at the top. Carnegie did not invent this system, but he perfected it for the industrial age. The Homestead Strike of 1892 exposed the violence inherent in Carnegie's system. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was one of the strongest unions in America. The Homestead Mill near Pittsburgh was its stronghold. When the union contract came up for renewal in June 1892, Carnegie's partner, Henry Clay Frick, offered terms that would cut wages by 18 to 26%. The union refused. Carnegie was conveniently in Scotland, leaving Frick to manage the confrontation. This was deliberate. Carnegie could maintain his public image as a friend of labor, while Frick did the violent work of breaking the Union. On June 28, 1892, Frick locked out the workers and surrounded the Homestead Mill with a 3-mile fence topped with barbed wire. Locals called it Fort Frick. Then, on July 6th, Frick hired 300 Pinkerton agents to take control of the mill by force. The Pinkertons arrived by barge at 4 in the morning. Workers and townspeople lined the riverbank. What happened next was a battle. Gunfire erupted. The fighting lasted all day. 3 Pinkertons were killed. 7 workers and townspeople were killed. Dozens more were wounded. The Pinkertons eventually surrendered and were forced to run a gauntlet of angry strikers who beat them with fists and clubs. Think about what this meant in practical terms. An American company hired a private army to attack American workers with lethal force. This was not some foreign war or frontier conflict. This was Pittsburgh. And the violence was not spontaneous. It was planned, funded, and executed by one of America's most celebrated industrialists, operating through a manager who explicitly believed that workers had no right to negotiate wages. The state militia arrived on July 12th and occupied Homestead with 8,000 troops. The strike continued, but the mill reopened with replacement workers protected by state power. The Union was broken. By November 1892, the strike had failed completely. The Amalgamated Association never recovered its power in the steel industry. Carnegie's mills would remain non-union for the next 45 years, until the Congress of Industrial Organizations finally organized U.S. Steel in 1937. That is 45 years during which Carnegie and his successors controlled wages and conditions with virtually no worker resistance. Carnegie claimed he had nothing to do with Homestead because he was in Scotland. This was a lie by omission. Carnegie corresponded regularly with Frick throughout the crisis. On July 4th, 2 days before the battle, Carnegie sent Frick a telegram that said simply, "All anxiety gone, since you stand firm." Carnegie knew what Frick was planning. He approved of it. He just made sure his name was not directly attached to the violence. But that was just the beginning of the pattern's full revelation. The Homestead strike showed other industrialists exactly how to break unions. Use lockouts, hire replacement workers, deploy private security or state militia, wait out the strikers until poverty forced them to accept any terms. The sequence was documented, refined, and repeated across American industry. In 1894, the Pullman strike followed the same pattern. In 1902, the anthracite coal strike. In 1937, the Memorial Day massacre at Republic Steel. The mechanism Carnegie had perfected at Homestead became standard practice. The scale of Carnegie's wealth extraction is staggering when you look at actual records. Between 1889 and 1899, Carnegie Steel Company earned total profits of approximately $133 million. Carnegie personally owned approximately 58% of the company. That means he extracted roughly $77 million in profits over 10 years, equivalent to approximately $2.5 billion in today's money. During the same period, his workers earned perhaps $6,000 total over those 10 years, if they worked continuously, which most could not, due to injury, illness, or seasonal layoffs. The wealth ratio was approximately 12,000 to 1. But here is where the pattern reveals something even more important. Carnegie did not hoard his wealth in traditional ways. He spent the last decades of his life giving it away. Between 1901 and his death in 1919, Carnegie donated approximately $350 million, equivalent to roughly $6 billion today. He built 2,800 public libraries across America and Europe. He founded Carnegie Mellon University, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. His name became synonymous not with labor exploitation, but with philanthropy and culture. This was not hypocrisy. This was genius. Carnegie had discovered something that Rockefeller would perfect, and that today's billionaires have fully embraced. Extreme wealth extraction could be rebranded as virtue through strategic giving. The libraries Carnegie built cost approximately $2 million each in today's money. The wages he suppressed over his career cost his workers hundreds of millions in lost earnings. But people remembered the libraries, not the wage theft. They celebrated the philanthropist, not the union breaker. The parallel to today's tech billionaires is striking. When Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, or Mark Zuckerberg pledge billions to charity, while their companies engage in tax avoidance, labor suppression, or market manipulation, they are following the Carnegie playbook exactly. Extreme wealth concentration justified through eventual redistribution. The system extracts value brutally, then returns a fraction of it publicly and calls this generosity. Carnegie did not invent this pattern, but he perfected it and legitimized it for American capitalism. And then it got worse. In 1901, J.P. Morgan approached Carnegie about selling his steel company. Morgan was assembling U.S. Steel, a trust that would control 67% of American steel production. Carnegie named his price, $480 million. Morgan agreed immediately. When Morgan's associate, Charles Schwab, asked if Carnegie would take bonds instead of cash, Carnegie agreed, though he later claimed this was foolish. The sale made Carnegie the richest person in the world. The equivalent today would be approximately $310 billion, making Carnegie wealthier than any current billionaire. Think about what this transaction meant in practical terms. Carnegie had extracted hundreds of millions in profits from workers who earned survival wages. He had broken the strongest union in American steel. He had created a system where workers had no power to negotiate and died in preventable accidents at rates exceeding 2 per week. And then he sold that system for a sum so large it represented more wealth than his workers would collectively earn in multiple generations. The violence was not just the Homestead battle. The violence was the system itself, operating legally and celebrated publicly. U.S. Steel, under Morgan's control, would continue Carnegie's practices. Wages remained suppressed. Working conditions remained dangerous. The 12-hour day, 7-day week continued until 1923, when public pressure finally forced the 8-hour day. But even that reform came only after decades of labor organizing and hundreds more deaths. The system Carnegie built was so efficient at extracting value and so protected by law and state power that it required massive social movements to even slightly modify it. The breaking point came not from moral awakening, but from labor's organized resistance and the Great Depression's revelation of capitalism's instability. The Amalgamated Association never recovered from Homestead, but new unions rose in the 1930s. The Congress of Industrial Organizations organized across entire industries, not just skilled trades. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave workers legal protection to organize. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wage and maximum hours. These were not gifts from benevolent industrialists. These were hard-won victories extracted through strikes, sit-downs, and sometimes violence. But even after these reforms, the Carnegie pattern continued operating in modified form. U.S. Steel remained one of America's largest corporations until foreign competition and technological change finally eroded its dominance in the 1970s and 1980s. The ratio between CEO compensation and worker wages, which had narrowed somewhat during the mid-20th century, began expanding again in the 1980s. By 2000, the ratio had returned to levels not seen since Carnegie's era. Today, the ratio between median S&P 500 CEO compensation and median worker pay is approximately 350 to 1. Not as extreme as Carnegie's 43,000 to 1, but following the same trajectory. The steel mills Carnegie built are mostly gone now. Homestead is a shopping center. The Edgar Thomson Works still operates, but employs only a few hundred workers instead of thousands. But the system Carnegie perfected has spread across the entire economy. Amazon warehouse workers earn survival wages, while Jeff Bezos accumulated $200 billion in wealth. Walmart suppresses wages and union organizing, while the Walton family controls over $200 billion. The technology sector celebrates disruption while concentrating wealth at levels that would make Carnegie envious. And here is where the contemporary pattern is actually worse than Carnegie's historical version. Carnegie at least built physical infrastructure. His mills produced steel that built bridges, buildings, and railroads. Today's wealth extraction often produces nothing tangible. Financial engineering, stock buybacks, and asset inflation generate paper wealth, while American infrastructure crumbles and real wages stagnate. The mechanism is the same: consolidate power, suppress labor, extract value, concentrate wealth. But the justification is even thinner. Carnegie spent his final years writing essays on wealth and social responsibility. His most famous work, The Gospel of Wealth, argued that rich men had a moral duty to give away their fortunes. But the essay never questioned how those fortunes were acquired. It never asked whether the system that enabled such extreme wealth concentration might itself be unjust. It simply assumed that if wealthy men gave some money back, that justified everything else. This framing became the template for American philanthropy. Gates, Buffett, Zuckerberg all follow Carnegie's model. Make billions through systems that concentrate wealth and suppress labor, then give some of it away and call yourself a hero. So let us connect all the pieces. Andrew Carnegie arrived in America with nothing and became the richest man in the world. The story we tell celebrates his intelligence, work ethic, and eventual generosity. But beneath that surface narrative lies a different architecture. Carnegie perfected a system of industrial wealth extraction that treated labor as a cost to be minimized, and workers as replaceable inputs. He used economic crisis to consolidate power. He broke unions through violence and state force. He suppressed wages while accumulating profits at ratios never before achieved in American history. And then he rebranded this extraction as virtue through strategic philanthropy. The pattern did not end with Carnegie. It spread across American industry and evolved with each economic era. Every time you hear about a tech billionaire pledging their fortune to charity while their company fights unionization, you are seeing Carnegie's system operating. Every time a corporation uses economic crisis to cut wages and increase executive compensation, you are seeing Carnegie's playbook. Every time extreme wealth concentration is justified through eventual giving, You are seeing Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. The steel mills are gone, but the mechanism remains. The names change, the industries evolve, but the fundamental architecture persists. Capital consolidates. Labor weakens. Wealth concentrates. And those who control the system celebrate themselves as heroes, while those who produce the value struggle to survive. We are not living in a world shaped by individual brilliance and the promise of upward mobility. We are living in a world shaped by a system Carnegie helped perfect, one that extracts value from labor, concentrates it at the top, and then justifies that concentration through selective generosity. The libraries are real. The philanthropy is real. But so is the exploitation that funded them. And the pattern never stopped operating. It just learned to hide itself better behind the language of innovation, disruption, and charitable giving. Carnegie did not invent American capitalism's inequality, but he showed how extreme that inequality could become, and how easily it could be celebrated rather than questioned. That is his real legacy, and it is still being built, one billionaire at a time.